It sure is fun to hear these two ladies sing, isn't it? Isn't it? It's just nice. So much fun. Well, I'm going to do a little something here I haven't done in this new space. Oh, boy. Thank you, sir. I am going to do what I was telling someone earlier, I love doing this kind of thing where you take kind of pretty disparate ideas or disparate images or disparate objects, stories, themes, and then throw them out there and see if you can't make a connection. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I do. I love to try to find things that seem completely unrelated and to find some kind of connection. I like doing that with people all the time, just to listen to one another's stories and start realizing we got more in common than I assumed beforehand. So this morning I want to talk with you as we finish this up about the art of gathering, and I want to look at this text about Gamaliel and the early Christians, being spared instead of thrown before the Sanhedrin, and I want to think with you about kindness. But before they do that, I want to sing for you the story of David and Goliath. And then I want you to start figuring out, what in the world does that have to do with kindness? And just keep in mind, I haven't done this in a while, and I didn't rehearse. Well, David was a dancing boy. I said David was a dancing boy. And dancing before the Lord gave him joy. Well, now David, as a young man, was a shepherd. And he was watching his uncle's flock when he looked across the field and he saw something come out from a rock. A lion began to creep, but David didn't peep. He just watched that lion getting closer and closer to his sheep. And he knew just what he had to do. He reached down to the side of his pouch there. He always carried a little pouch, a leather pouch, slingshot. And he reached down, grabbed up a couple of stones, put those small stones in the middle of that slingshot, once, twice, thrice around his head, let it fly through the air, and then hit that lion and gave him a scare. And this is what David began to cry. See, I told you, I almost forgot here. Great is the name of the Lord, and greatly to be praised. God protects me from lions and helps me in strange, mysterious ways. And then he'd say, hallelujah, and that's your part. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. And he said, great is the name of the Lord. It's coming back to me now. When now David was a singing boy. I said David was a singing boy. And singing before the Lord brought him joy. Well, now one day, David was out watching his sheep. When all of a sudden he looked way over there, David saw a bear. But David wasn't scared. He just reached down, grabbed that slingshot, and he knew just what to do. He took 3 swings around his head and let that rock fly. Hit the air, hit the bear between the eyes. The bear ran off, started to cry, and this is what David sang. Great is the name of the Lord, and greatly to be praised. God protects me from lions, helps me face bears, helps me in mysterious ways. And what'd he say? Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. It's like a revival. Hallelujah. He said, great is the name of the Lord. Well, now, one day, David was watching his sheep, and the most frightening sight he ever did see came up over the hill. 3 of the king's men, dressed to the nines, they were administrators. He reached down for the slingshot and then figured I probably shouldn't do that. So he put the slingshot back on his belt, and then he saw the administrators. He smiled, and he says, what can I do for you fellas? And they looked at him, and he said, David, right now, King Saul is in a terrible fix. And Saul, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Where am I? So King Saul's in a terrible fix, and he's facing the Philistines, and the Philistines are getting the best of the Israelites. And right now the Israelites are all running and hiding. What are we going to do? And so King Saul wants you to come over. He loves your ukulele. He thinks your ukulele is really soothing, and he wants you to come over there. It's in there. It's in the Bible. Go look. And he wants you to come over and soothe him. He loves your music, and it calms him down. Maybe this will inspire him. And David says, well, I don't know much about battles and wars and things, but I'd be happy to sing for the king. And so David was about to walk away from the sheep, and he says, but who's going to watch my sheep? And the three administrators said, well, we don't know nothing about sheep. But David handed the staff over to the administrators anyway. It's a corporate joke. And as he approached the hillside and crossed the valley, he could see that the valley was empty except for a bunch of big trees, Lebanon trees. And then up on the other one side was all the Philistines mocking on the other side where the Israelites were all hiding. And he made his way up into the tent, and he saw the king sitting there. He's actually down kneeling, kind of with his face in his hands. And he looked up, saw David, said, son, you should probably just go on. This is no place for a boy. And he said, well, what's the matter, king? And he says, well, right now, we got the biggest challenge we've ever faced out there, and they're getting the best of it. It's humiliating, and everyone's scared, and we're defeated. You should just go. It's ugly. And David says, well, I don't understand. I don't get it. And he looked out on the field, and he says, I don't see anyone out there. He says, right now, David, maybe if you look again, they've got a giant out there who's challenged us one-on-one. Take anyone on, and winner takes all. Not one of my men's willing to go up against that giant. He looked down there again, and he saw this big tree, and he says, look again, that tree's got a helmet on its head. He said, well, he is big. What's his name? The King Saul said his name's Goliath. You know what that means? Might as well Goliath down and give up. When you couldn't imagine how long it took me to come up with that one. Well, David, he looked at the king and he says, I'm not afraid to face giants. I've been facing bears. I've faced lions. I faced all sorts of fears. And somehow God is always with me. I think I could face this giant. And so the king saw something in David that maybe he remembered he'd once had, but now long forgotten. And he says, all right, well, maybe you can do something. And David was going to go out there. He says, well, you take my armor with you. And he put his armor on David. And the armor was heavy. It was like 30-pound chainmail shirt. It was like a 20-pound brass helmet. It was a spear that was about 8 feet long for a 4.5-foot boy. And pretty soon he took 2 steps, fell over, and he says, I can't work with this. And so he stood up and he took it all off. And he looked at the king. He says, I always have what I've always needed. I know what I'm about. Ukulele goes with me everywhere. I think I can handle this. And so David took his ukulele, slingshot by his side, walked down in the valley. Great is the name of the Lord, and greatly to be praised. God protects me from bears, helps me face lions. And when he got down to the bottom of the valley, he suddenly stepped into a shadow that was so dark he thought maybe he'd walked into the clouds. He looked up above him, and it was just a giant head blocking the sun's light. And the giant looked down and said, what did they send me but a puppy to fight Goliath? Well, little puppy, I'm going to squash you. And he lifted up his huge, column-like leg and came straight down on top of David. David was a dancing boy, and he just did a 2-step right out of the way. Well, you're a fast little puppy, aren't you? He reached back, and he got his armor bearer to give him his spear and said, I'm going to shishka dog you. That's always a gauge whether or not anybody's still with me at this point. And he threw it straight to David, but David was a dancing boy. And he dodged right out of the way, and as Goliath was looking for the next thing he would use to try to defeat David, David started looking in the ground. And the old stories, the old Hasidic stories say that as David was looking for stones, stones went rolling as fast away as they could in every direction, saying, we don't want any part of this. But David reached down and found one stone that seemed to be crying out, and he placed that in the pouch, and he went 3 times, once, twice, thrice, let it fly, hit that giant between the eyes. The giant fell over and died. This is what David cried. Great is the name of the Lord, and greatly to be praised. God protects me from bears, helps me face lions, help me defeat a giant today. And what'd he say? Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. And he said, great is the name. He said, great is the name. He said, great is the name of the Lord. So, thank you. So, I really am going to make that work somehow as we get into this. This story fascinated me. I was looking at something else when Brad and I and Sharmal talked. I was looking at a different text entirely. This story fascinated me. You know, the movements of the early church, there were several movements happening, right? There were several messianic movements that are taking place, claiming to be the one that had the Messiah. And so it mentions a couple of them in here. And these two are squelched pretty quickly as the story goes. But here comes Peter, Philip, Stephen, the early apostles, and they're walking through Jerusalem. They're preaching around Jerusalem, right? They're antithetical to the temple. And yet, for some reason, Gamaliel, who's a Pharisee and a highly thought of Pharisee, and was probably one of the leading Pharisees in the Sanhedrin school and in the courts, and he's suggesting to them, just wait a minute, maybe there's something else here. It's so anathema to the setting. Was it just because they were no threat whatsoever? Or was it because there was something else that Gamaliel saw in this that he didn't see in the others? The old Christian traditions say that Gamaliel basically became Christian in the end. They sort of take it that direction. The ancient Pharisaic and Judaic traditions say that he remained a Jew and a leader, but not as much as a highly ranking a teacher and leader in the Sanhedrin over time. He was less and less thought of. There's historical context written up about both of these ideas, both of these orientations. But to me, there's something else there. There's something else that's happening. And I think it's important when we think about the art of gathering. I think it's important when we think about who we are and why we are. And so I want to play with this idea that maybe at the heart of it, there's this possible radical idea that maybe at the heart of what they were doing, at the heart of what they were practicing, what transformed or changed Gamaliel's mind is this idea of kindness. And it's kind of a radical, simplistic idea, but I want us to think about it for a moment. I want us to kind of look back and go, is that what they were offering that's different? Now, it's funny because my younger son had his daughter Eleanor over, and they spent the day yesterday and then spent the night last night, and they brought over she has this little musical school bus, and it's a cute little school bus. You know, you push it, it has 10,000 things it says, and it recycles them again, you know, and she races through them all so she can get to the one thing that she likes the most, and then ignores everything else. But the one thing she likes is the song right before this, and then this, and it says, be nice, not just once or twice, be warm and kind with the folks you find, with always something nice on your mind. And she'll dance to that, and then she'll go through it 20 times, you know, and get back to be nice. And I'm thinking, you know, you remember when you were a kid? Maybe you remember when your kids were kids. Maybe some of you young adults in here remember when you were kids, and you remember how your parents had these toys, and you had these songs like on Sesame Street, and you had them in the classroom too. Practice niceness, practice kindness, rules for the playground, right? These ideas of being kind to one another. And, you know, and it's ingrained in us, right? And then what happens? What happens to all that in our culture? It's so fascinating to me that you know, here it is, that another young child, a toddler, we're training up in the right way. And then what happens? What's going to happen? Where does it get lost? And so this idea of kindness is something we think about practicing. We think that we have a church that is certainly kind. We do kind things for one another. And no doubt that many of us in here, I'm going to say every one of us in here, practices levels of kindness. But I'm going to encourage us to think it might be a little something different too. And maybe that's what's missing in our culture today. What's been missing, you know, off and on in our culture historically. It's interesting. We are never as kind as we want to be. But nothing outrages us more than people who are unkind to us. Isn't that true? I was having dinner with a friend the other night, and she was telling me how she was riding along the highway, and it was a morning rush hour kind of thing. And then she got off, and she was coming down towards downtown, and she got off on Cherry Lane, and all of a sudden, she said this car kind of just pulled right up on her on the back. You know, it was like tailing her, flashing lights, and then pulled beside her, and then just pulled right up, parallel, driving along, rolled down the window, and just flipped her off, and started saying something. And my friend said, she was like, what did I do? What did I do? I have no idea what I did. Did she accidentally pull in front of somebody, cut somebody off? She had absolutely no idea. She kind of shrugged her shoulders, and she kept on, and tried to make a gesture of, I'm sorry, kept on driving, but they kept going. It just continued until finally she got a little concerned and sort of just pulled off a different direction for fear this person might just keep following them. The very next day, our own security guard told me a story about someone last week who I don't think she was even a member of this church, but she had another experience of kind of road rage and came around to the church where the person continued to follow her until she pulled in the parking lot because she saw moms and dads dropping off their kids, and then she saw a security guard at the front door and pulled up to the door. And the car kind of circled out of the lot and drove off. And she said, I don't have a kid here, but I'm really glad your church is here. What is it, right, about our culture right now there's so much anger in our culture? And how do we deal with that? I mean, we'd love to be more kind, but the reality is that we really are infuriated when somebody's unkind to us because it just doesn't seem right. This is something that Simone Weil, the philosopher and French activist, wrote back in 1933 as she was thinking about the state of the world in 1933. So you think about it: poverty, war, conflict. And she wrote this. She said, "Never react to an evil in such a way as to augment it." Never react to an evil in such a way as to augment it. Is she saying killing evil with kindness? I mean, is it that simple? Or is there something else? Modern life is no fairy tale, and one of the most disorienting perplexities is that evil isn't always as easily recognizable as a Grimm's fairy tale evil stepmother or as a giant warrior knocking over other soldiers and threatening a whole people. It might come in the insidious form instead of our own acquiescence, or our own feelings of being overwhelmed, or even our own feelings of rage and indignation. One of my favorite writers has become this, you all know this writer, this poet, Naomi Shihab Nye, who is from Muslim background, and Palestinian, I believe. She says that nicety is different from kindness. Politeness is not the same as kindness. And we often find those things in challenging instances when we must rise above the impulse towards its opposite because we are ignited by fear and anger and despair. And so she asked this question: do I consider myself really, truly a kind person? Do you consider yourself a kind person? And she wrote this poem called Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose yourself. You must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in the weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so that you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride thinking the bus will never stop, the passengers eating chicken and maize staring out the window. Before you can learn the tenderness and gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that was keeping him alive. Before you can know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it until your voice catches the thread of all the sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. It is only kindness now that literally ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. It is only kindness then that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. There is a kindness in sort of way that is polite and is generous, and yet it's not really changing things. It may make things livable, sustainable for a moment, but is it really changing anything? What were those early Christians doing that made such a difference in light of the temple, in light of Judaic practices that had gotten so far out of hand, that had gotten so far away from the covenant of not just caring for one another, but including others in life. If you look up the word kind, it's an interesting etymology because the word kind actually has its roots in kin. It actually has its roots in this idea of naturally connected, this natural order, this relationship with others. There's this sense in which kindness is really about kinship. And that may be the challenge for us, right? That may be the ultimate challenge for us in terms of what it means to be kind. Martin Luther King said it all boils down to this: all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one's destiny affects all of us indirectly. We used to sing a wonderful little song in here, the band did. It was called When One of Us is Chained. And it went, one of us chained, all of us is chained. None of us is free. This idea that kindness is first and foremost kinship, and action follows that. When I was in Clovis, New Mexico, I had this great opportunity to go work at this school called the Bella Vista School of Arts. It's an elementary school. I knew I was in the right place, but I also knew I was in sort of a strange place because Clovis, New Mexico is a prison town. Some of you know Clovis, New Mexico. Probably a third of its population have someone related in prison. It's a very oppressed kind of community that's struggling along but still making ends meet. I walked into this one school that wasn't far from the prison, Bella Vista Art School. It was probably 300-400 students. As I was walking down the hall, I could hear the kids having their Friday rally, and they started off with this line: "Let us turn our thoughts today to Martin Luther King and recognize that there are ties in 20-part harmony between us, all men and women living on the earth, ties of hope and love, sister and brotherhood." You know the song? James Taylor, Shed a Little Light. They sang that song for their rally. I thought, where am I? And here was this school of just mixed race, mixed ethnic background, families that are so broken and in sheds and pieces and shards, and yet here's this school singing together this song of hope. I thought, this is church, but it's happening in this public school. And the community, of course, rallied behind these kids is what had happened. They saw them as kin. Just because they were different background, different race, different families, it didn't matter. They saw one another as kin, and in the process of seeing each other in kinship, they began to rebuild their community. But not just their community, they began to rebuild their enthusiasm for life. And so through art and creative projects and endeavors, they pursue learning. And it became a model for several schools until it got too large to try to accommodate. So now it's one of those sort of charter schools and has 3 times the size of that population and a much larger campus. But still that mission, still that vision. You don't learn well in society until you become together in society, until you get together. That's the only way for us to learn well. And what are those people doing? What were those guys doing? What were those people, those men and women, in fact, in that early church? What were they doing that was so distinctive? Well, if you follow along with their history, there's men, there's women in the leadership, there's Gentile, there's Jew, there's slave and free. This community was moving about beneath the shadow of an institution of oppression and saying, you belong, you belong. God's love is here for you, you belong. And they shared everything equally. Kindness became very simply a way of seeing one another. So I close with this idea. We think of what prevents us from being kind, right? I mean, the minute I start talking about the other, and we live in this polarized community, we are defined by polarization. We're not defined by we have this trouble in getting along with each other. We're defined by polarization. Who are you? What do you vote for? What do you stand for? I'm on the neighborhood network, and someone says, hey, I'm picking up some Beto signs. Already I say Beto. Some of you are like, I mean, we just orient around polarity. We're not even thinking anymore, right? We've forgotten our connectedness. And so as soon as somebody said that online, somebody else came online and said, bring them over to my house, I'm going to burn them. And then someone else said, you're going to pick up some cruise signs. And so the person said, sure, I'll go get you cruise signs as well, And it just sort of shut it down, right? But we orient first around polarity, always now. How do we get past the fear? How do we get past this giant-sized fear that we live in front of? And my suggestion is, it's maybe the simplest thing we can do, but we have to learn to sort of like our own selves. We have to learn to open up a little bit vulnerably and allow ourselves to kind of permeate and be connected with others. But only through those small acts of kindness and connection, I think, do we begin to challenge this giant fear that we are living in. So, one last thing. Y'all keep playing. Yep. I asked them to do this now. It's like those talk shows, They're like going, come on, get off the stage. It's time to get going. One last thing. I'm going to make an example of my friend Peter here. This world needs kindness, right? I mean, that's just the reality. We need kindness, but we don't need just nice, generous acts. There's plenty of that. We need people seeing one another as connected. We need it like the guy who was down at the Old South Pancake House when my son was having dinner, and he came over and he says, hey, my brother, how are you doing? He was a black guy, and Tim was like, hey, I'm doing great. And he was saying my brother, my sister to everyone. Then he went over to an older gentleman, and he said, yes, sir, can I help you? And the man ordered some food, and then he came back, and he's talking to my brother. And then finally Tim said, why do you say that? I mean, I appreciate that. I'm white. I kind of represent the oppressive ones, And he said, oh, no. He says, Dr. King reminded us we're not going to get anywhere until we can see our connections. And he said, so I see our connections. He said, now that man over there, he doesn't know we're connected yet. So I'm just taking it easy with him. But you already sensed that. And we'll figure all the rest of it once we figure out we're connected. There's a lot to learn from one another when we actually sit down and pay attention and open up enough to listen past the giant that stands before us.